Problem has never been what to practice, it's how to practice. But in case you don't know what to practice, let me break it down for you in about 15 minutes. These are the 3 pillars of jazz mastery. Everything you need to know to learn and master jazz improvisation falls under these 3 pillars. If you don't know who I am, my name is Matt Tenbrook, and I am by no means a jazz master. However, in under 6 years of ever picking up the saxophone, I've become a professional, meaning I do this full time. I've gained some notoriety on social media, booked some cool gigs. This isn't about me, but that's who I am. Again, the problem isn't what to practice. It really becomes quite simple when you realize everything that's required to learn jazz falls under these 3 pillars. Before we get into the 3 pillars, there's a lot of reasons players get stuck. Now, the internet is a great resource, but it is a bit of a double-edged sword, meaning that there is so much information out there, you can learn essentially anything you want, but it's easy to get lost in all the information and not knowing what you need to prioritize. Then there's the problem of people selling quick fix resources like PDF lick books or lead sheets, which isn't really the way that this music was ever learned or shared. Without a mentor or a teacher, trying to follow people's advice online really isn't a good way to get clear direction on developing your instrument and learning jazz. Which brings me into the 3 pillars. Everything you need to know about jazz improvisation falls under one of these 3 categories. I have yet to think about a single thing that you need to work on that doesn't fall under these categories. The 3 pillars of jazz mastery are the style, the language, and the repertoire. You can see I've even got the picture of the pillars there. It might look simple, they are very complex, but everything falls underneath one of these 3 categories. The first pillar is style, and I want to take you through a quick analogy with how we learn to speak as a child. Now, when I say style, I'm not talking about the fashion sense of Miles Davis, which we all wish we had. I'm talking about the style and the sound of jazz, what this music actually sounds like. The first sounds you ever made as a kid weren't actual words. You were imitating your parents' lips and vocal movements, emphasizing syllables, trying to recreate words. It's the reason why a baby's first words is usually goo goo gaga. This is because we operate from a sense of mimicry in the beginning. There's a reason why your parents aren't looking at you saying, ambidextrous. They're saying, mama, dada, right? Because it's phonetic, you can see the lips, and you can try and recreate it. You don't start by reading, you start by listening. Nobody puts a baby in front of a dictionary and then says, all right, kid, read that and try to learn how to speak. We can take this analogy directly into the style of jazz. There's a reason why when you ask any non-musician what scatting is, they can actually give a pretty decent idea or impersonation. Most people will go like, scap bop boodop buddy bop boodop, right? And while we know that isn't what actual jazz scatting sounds like, the general idea and premise is there. And spoiler alert, that person's perception didn't come from reading that on a page. It came from listening to jazz and being familiar with scat singing. The biggest component with style is listening. This is how we can practice listening. There's 2 main types of listening. There's active listening and there's passive listening. Passive listening is when you're doing homework, doing laundry, going for a walk, and you have music playing in the background. You're not actively listening to it. It's more just something playing. Active listening or focused listening is when we're listening to the music to hear specific things. Some of the things we might listen for right away: the time feel. Is the player rushing or are they dragging? The articulation of any musician playing their instrument. How does Christian McBride pluck the bass? How does Joshua Redman tongue the reed? How does Brad Meldau strike the keys? How does Brian Blade hit the drums, right? It's all articulation. Then we have vibrato of the musician, right? What is their breath doing to the note as they sustain it out? Those are all specific examples, but think about it more broadly. How would you describe the tone color of musicians when they play? Is it bright? Is it dark? What is the emotion that the music they're playing conveys? How does it make you feel? And what is the energy like? Do we have a cool Paul Desmond quintet West Coast vibe? Or do we have a Mach 10 John Coltrane quartet vibe going on all 4 cylinders? Ultimately, style is familiarizing yourself with how the music sounds. If you can't hear in your head how something is supposed to sound, how are you ever going to play it? This is the biggest problem with reading sheet music off the page, playing lick books, playing the PDFs, is that you're not actually listening and hearing what the style of the music is. And again, a lot of this is really specific, and you may not be able to name what everything specifically is, but it's the reason you can tell the difference between Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane just by listening to them. Pillar 2 is the language of the music. Now back to the speaking analogy, if style is the specific words like mama, dada, cookie, language is going to be combining the words together to form a thought or sentences. At first, your sentences you said didn't make much sense, like me want food, me want cookie. But once you gain sophistication in combining words or jazz phrases together, you start saying more elaborate sentences like, hello, mother, I would please like a delicious chocolate chip cookie. This is exactly what we talk about when we say the language of jazz, right? There's a reason why our favorite players sound like they're speaking or singing directly through their horn and through their musical phrases. There's a great analogy from an author that I really like, Eckhart Tolle, about the word honey. And that's that once you've tasted and seen honey, the word honey doesn't actually mean anything in and of itself. The word is simply directing you to a specific emotion, a specific taste. And that's exactly what we want to achieve with our improvisation, which is why we have to master language. The strategies for developing language come a lot from style, whereas listening is the important aspect. The first step is transcribing great solos from your favorite musicians. When we say transcribing, we're not talking about writing down or reading. We're talking about learning by ear. I want to iterate, reading transcriptions isn't inherently bad. You're just not actively working on the skills which we need to work on, which is ear training, memorization, and integration of the language into our minds. Once we've learned some great solos that we like, we want to take phrases and ideas from those solos through all 12 keys. Playing in all 12 keys is essential to gain fluently in jazz when you have so many different key centers in every song. Don't sleep on the difficult keys because that is often where you need the most practice. Next, you can study the geometry of the lines, break down the line science, but that's all really technical stuff. Essentially, what you want to get to as fast as possible is what is the emotion of this piece of language? When John Coltrane plays this 8-bar phrase, how do I feel? What is the energy behind it? Back to the speaking analogy, it's about knowing what you're trying to convey when you speak. Saying the sentence, "Are you ambidextrous?" means, can you use both of your hands interchangeably as dominant hands? I might have an 8th note phrase from John Coltrane that I really like, but what is the emotion it's trying to convey? That leads us to the final pillar of the music, which is the repertoire. We've talked about how to say things, which is the style, what to say, which is the language, but when and where to say things is the repertoire. It's the music of jazz. It's often called tunes, standards, heads, songs. If style is the words, language is the sentences, then repertoire is the medium in which we deliver the stories. You're going to write differently if you're writing a newspaper article versus if you're writing a novel. It's the same way that you're going to play differently if you're playing a slow, smooth ballad versus an up-tempo, fast swing. There are many factors in learning the repertoire, which are as follows. First, addressing the elephant in the room, I have a crossed-out real book. For those of you who don't know, the real book is essentially a big book full of sheet music for a lot of jazz songs. Now, I want to emphasize again, there is nothing bad about reading music out of a real book. The difference is reading out of a real book isn't actually learning, internalizing, and mastering the repertoire. You're again just reading sheet music. The first thing you need to work on when learning repertoire is the melody. The melody is the line of a song that you sing. If I told you to sing the melody of Happy Birthday, you would do When learning a jazz standard, you want to hear the melody in its purest form. There are some great artists who typically play melodies without many embellishments, and those are on the screen below. Next, the lyrics of a standard are very important, and they're often overlooked by instrumentalists. While a melody is the most important part of a song, the lyrics are what the melody is actually saying. I might approach a sad, melancholy romance medley differently as an improviser versus a happy, upbeat, feel-good melody. Next, you need to learn the chords and the chord progression, yes, even if you are a single-note instrument like saxophone, trumpet, trombone. When learning chords, it's important to first break them down into their simplest form with no extensions, no alterations, and then from there you can go into all that extra stuff. When mastering a standard, you should know the quality of every chord and what notes exist in that chord. Next, we have the song form, which is a crucial step to actually knowing every standard. There are a few key song forms used many times, like the AABA form or the 12-bar blues form. The AABA form is typically 4 8-bar sections with a different section in the middle, which is the B section. And the 12-bar blues form typically has 3 chords played over 12 bars. Next, you'll want to learn how these songs are started and ended based on different recordings, different cliches in the songs, such as like key changes, weird bridge sections between the solos. And this all comes from just listening to different recordings of standards or songs as you learn them. Again, back to emphasizing that the most important part of all of this is listening. That essentially wraps it up. At its foundation, these are the 3 pillars that learning jazz is all going to fall under. While you can get incredibly nuanced and complex within each of these pillars, these are what they are at their foundation. Now, the real issue is how to practice. Once you have these pillars, how do you transform those into practice plans, into specific goals that you can work on every day to get better at your instrument? How do you structure practice to efficiently use your time? One thing that's really important to emphasize is that different goals are going to have different approaches. The modern jazz improviser versus the wedding gig saxophonist versus the Duke Ellington Revival lead tenor player are all going to have different practice plans. At their foundation, they need the same skills, but once they get more focused, they'll be going in a different direction. This leads me to the 3 pillars of development, which are structure, feedback, and accountability. This is why it benefits so much to working with a mentor or working with a private teacher. If you're interested in working with me, I'm opening my private studio to about 15 serious students. If you're interested, you can drop your email below to get more information. But regardless, take this formula and add 10,000 hours of focused practice, and then you'll be a jazz master. Thanks for watching.